The morning sun fell sharp and clean across the parade ground at Fort Bragg, the kind of light that makes everything look rehearsed. Crisp uniforms, polished brass, flags that snapped in the autumn wind like they'd been practicing all night. It was October 2019, and the ceremony was scheduled to begin in 40 minutes. Colonel Marcus Webb stood near the memorial wall, running through his notes one final time. 23 years in the Army had taught him that ceremonies were performances, and performances required precision. Today's event was no different. The Distinguished Service Cross would be presented, speeches would be made, a name would be added to a wall that already held too many. What made today unusual was the recipient. Webb folded his notes and tucked them into his jacket pocket. He'd read the citation 17 times. He still wasn't sure he believed it. Across the parade ground, past the rows of white folding chairs and the podium draped in regimental colors, a checkpoint had been established at the East Gate, standard procedure for high-profile events. 2 young soldiers stood watch there, both of them barely old enough to vote, both of them certain they understood how the world worked. Their names were Specialist Ryan Kowalski and Private First Class Derek Tanner. They'd drawn gate duty through the peculiar lottery of military scheduling, and neither was particularly happy about it. Gate duty meant standing. Gate duty meant checking IDs. Gate duty meant missing the ceremony itself, which promised to be historic. They'd heard rumors about today's honoree, some kind of intelligence officer, someone who'd done something classified in a place nobody could name. The details were fuzzy, which only made the speculation more elaborate. "I heard she called in an airstrike on her own position," Tanner said, adjusting his helmet strap. Kowalski shook his head. "That's not how intelligence officers work. They don't call in anything. They just analyze stuff." "Then why's she getting the DSC?" Kowalski didn't have an answer for that. The Distinguished Service Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor. You didn't get it for analyzing stuff. You got it for something else entirely. The first guests began arriving at U-815, generals and their wives, retired officers with campaign ribbons that told stories from wars most people had forgotten, a senator's aide who looked uncomfortable in the October chill. Each one presented credentials. Each one was waved through with appropriate deference. At R847, a taxi pulled up to the checkpoint. Kowalski watched it idle for a moment before the rear door opened. A woman stepped out. She was small, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore civilian clothes, a modest navy dress, and a cardigan that looked like it had seen better decades. No jewelry except for a thin chain around her neck. No makeup that he could see. She paid the driver and approached the wall. Checkpoint with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. Tanner straightened. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. There's a ceremony today." The woman nodded. "I know. I'm here for it." "Do you have credentials?" She reached into her small handbag and produced an ID. Tanner examined it, frowning. "This is a civilian contractor badge, ma'am. It doesn't grant access to today's event." "There should be a guest list," she said. Her voice was calm, unhurried, as if she'd expected this. "My name is Elena Vasquez." Tanner scanned the clipboard. He found no such name. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not on here." The woman, Elena Vasquez, looked at the clipboard and then at the young soldier holding it. Something flickered across her face, an expression that might have been amusement or might have been patience, the kind that comes from waiting a very long time. "Could you check again? Or perhaps call someone?" Kowalski stepped forward. He'd been watching the exchange with growing curiosity. This woman didn't seem like a crasher. She didn't seem confused. She seemed like someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be and was simply waiting for everyone else to figure it out. "Ma'am," he said, "what's your connection to today's ceremony?" Elena Vasquez looked at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, the kind of eyes that had seen things and chosen to keep seeing anyway. "I served," she said simply. "In what capacity?" A pause. Then, "I was an intelligence officer, attached to Special Operations Command." Tanner exchanged a glance with Kowalski. This was the intelligence officer? The one who'd done something so classified they couldn't even describe it in the press release? "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait here while we verify your identity." She nodded and stepped aside, standing with her hands clasped in front of her like someone accustomed to waiting. The October wind pulled at her cardigan. She didn't seem to notice. Inside the ceremony perimeter, Colonel Webb was conducting final checks when his aide approached with a radio. "Sir, there's an issue at the East Gate." "What kind of issue?" "A woman claiming she's supposed to be here. No credentials, name's not on the list." Webb frowned. The guest list had been finalized a week ago. It included 3 generals, 2 senators, the families of 18 fallen soldiers, and precisely 1 living recipient of today's honor. What's her name? Vasquez. Elena Vasquez. The name hit Webb like a rifle shot. He grabbed the radio. Do not let her leave. Do you understand me? Do not let her leave. The aide stared at him. Sir? But Webb was already walking, then jogging, then nearly running toward the east gate, his polished shoes striking the pavement with an urgency that turned heads across the parade ground. At the checkpoint, Tanner was explaining to Elena Vasquez that she would need to contact the ceremony coordinator when Colonel Webb arrived, slightly out of breath and looking at the small woman in the Navy, dressed as if she were a ghost. Captain Vasquez, he said. She smiled. It was a small smile, almost apologetic. It's just Ms. Vasquez now, sir. I've been out for 3 years. Webb turned to Tanner and Kowalski. His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it that neither young soldier had ever heard from a superior officer. This woman, Webb said quietly, is the guest of honor. This woman is the reason we're all standing here today. This woman saved the lives of 23 American soldiers and 64 Afghan civilians, and she did it while bleeding from wounds that would have killed most people I know. Tanner's face went pale. Sir, her name wasn't, I know. Webb turned back to Elena. I'm sorry, Captain. There was an administrative error. Your name was listed under your married name on one document and your maiden name on another. It happens, Elena said. She said it like she meant it, like being stopped at the gate of your own ceremony was just another small thing in a life full of larger ones. Webb extended his arm. May I escort you inside? Elena Vasquez took his arm, and as they walked together toward the parade ground, toward the rows of white chairs and the flags and the wall of names, Specialist Kowalski watched her go. He would think about that moment for a long time. The way she hadn't argued, the way she hadn't demanded to speak to anyone's supervisor, the way she'd simply waited, patient and certain, for the world to catch up to the truth. It would be years before he understood what he'd witnessed. The story of Elena Vasquez didn't begin at Fort Bragg. It began 7 years earlier, in a place that didn't officially exist, during an operation that would never appear in any history book, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, summer of 2012. The heat was a living thing, a presence that wrapped itself around everything and refused to let go. Elena was 31 years old, a newly promoted captain attached to a joint special operations task force, and she was the only woman in a compound full of men who weren't sure what to make of her. She'd arrived 3 weeks earlier with a briefcase full of classified documents and a reputation that preceded her like a warning. Intelligence analyst, Dari speaker, expert in tribal networks. The kind of officer who spent more time with maps and informants than with weapons. The team she'd been assigned to was a 12-man Special Forces unit, ODA 7255, commanded by a warrant officer named Chief Warrant Officer 3 Samuel Briggs. Briggs was a 20-year veteran with a face like weathered leather and a philosophy about intelligence officers that he made no effort to hide. They're tourists, he told his men before Elena arrived. They sit in air conditioning and tell us what we already know. Don't expect anything. Elena knew what they thought of her. She'd felt it in every room she'd ever entered, in every briefing she'd ever given. The slight delay before, someone acknowledged her presence. The way conversations shifted when she approached. The questions that were really tests. She didn't fight it. She'd learned long ago that fighting it only made things worse. Instead, she did her job. Her job at that moment was to locate a high-value target named Abdul Rashid Haqqani. Haqqani was a shadow, a man who moved through the tribal networks like water through sand, leaving nothing but rumors in his wake. He'd orchestrated 17 attacks on coalition forces in the past year. He'd killed Americans, Afghans, anyone who stood between him and his vision of a purified caliphate. Finding him was supposed to be impossible. Elena found him in 11 days. She did it the way she did everything, by listening, by watching, by noticing the things that other people dismissed. A pattern in the radio chatter, a cousin who traveled too often, a village that received supplies it shouldn't have been able to afford. When she brought her findings to Chief Briggs, he looked at her map, at the web of connections she'd drawn, at the single compound circled in red ink. You're sure, he said. I'm sure. He studied her for a long moment. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of a man recalculating, adjusting assumptions that had suddenly become inconvenient. All right, Briggs said finally. We'll check it out. The mission was planned for 3 nights later. 12 men would approach the compound under cover of darkness. Quick breach, capture or kill, 30 minutes on the ground, maximum. Elena requested to join them. The silence that followed her request was absolute. Captain, Briggs said slowly. That's not how this works. I speak Dari. I can identify Haqqani by voice and face. I know the layout of that compound better than anyone on this base. She paused. I'm not asking to kick down doors. I'm asking to be there when you need me. Briggs chewed on this. Around him, his men exchanged glances that carried years of shared experience and shared skepticism. You understand, Briggs said, that if you come, you're not a passenger. You're a liability I have to keep alive. I understand. And you understand that out there, your rank doesn't mean anything. Out there, you do what I say, when I say it. I understand. Briggs looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once. Wheels up at 2300. Elena spent the next 3 days preparing. She qualified on the M4 again, scoring expert despite the heat and the dust. She ran the compound approach in her head 100 times, memorizing every wall, every doorway, every shadow where a man might hide. She wrote letters to her mother and her sister, the kind of letters that service members write when they're not sure they'll be writing again. She didn't tell anyone about the letters. She didn't tell anyone about the fear that sat in her chest like a stone, or about the way her hands shook when no one was watching. She'd learned to carry those things quietly, beside her, shouting something she couldn't hear. She read his lips. Can you move? She didn't know. She tried. Her legs worked mostly. She got to her knees, then her feet. Her rifle was gone, somewhere in the dark. Webb pressed his sidearm into her hands. Stay behind me. Stay down. They moved along the wall, Elena stumbling, Webb firing, the world reduced to smoke and shadows and the terrible rhythm of gunfire. At the corner, they found Delaney. He was sitting against the wall with his hands pressed to his stomach, trying to hold in something that didn't want to stay. Tom, Webb said, just the name, just a name that carried everything. I'm okay, Delaney said. He wasn't okay. Anyone could see he wasn't okay. Elena knelt beside him. Her training took over, the medical courses she'd taken years ago, the procedures she'd practiced on dummies and prayed she'd never need. Keep pressure here, she told Webb. Don't let go. She found a field dressing in Delaney's kit and began to work. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady when it mattered. It was the only part of her that ever was. The firefight continued around them. Briggs was calling for extraction, his voice tight with something that might have been pain or might have been rage. The helicopters were 15 minutes out, an eternity in combat time. Then Elena heard something. It was faint, almost lost in the noise. A voice, a child's voice, crying. She looked up, past the wall, toward the compound. Through a gap in the masonry, she could see a building she'd studied 100 times in satellite photos. The village school. It was supposed to be empty. It wasn't empty. She could see them now, shadows moving inside, small shadows, children. There are kids in there, she said. Webb didn't look up from Delaney. What? The school. There are children in the school. She was already moving before she finished the sentence. Webb called after her, his voice carrying a word she didn't catch. A name, hers probably. It didn't matter. Elena ran toward the sound of crying. The school was a single-story building with walls the color of dried blood. Elena reached it by staying low, by using the smoke as cover, by being smaller and faster than anyone was looking for. The door was barricaded from outside, wooden beams wedged against it. Someone had locked those children in. She understood what that meant. She'd read enough intelligence reports to know what it meant when civilians were locked inside buildings during firefights. The children weren't hostages. They were human shields. Or worse, they were bait for a trap that hadn't sprung yet. Elena thought about her mother, about her sister, about the letters she'd written. Then she started pulling at the barricade. The wooden beams were heavy. Her hands were slick with blood, some of it hers. The gunfire continued behind her, closer now, and she could hear shouting in Pashto that sounded like commands. The barricade gave way. She pushed through the door and found darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she found faces. 18 of them. Children ranging from maybe 5 to maybe 12, huddled against the far wall like a single terrified organism. One of them, a girl with a scar across her forehead, spoke in rapid Dari. The bad men put us here. The bad men said to stay. Elena answered in the same language. The bad men are gone. I'm going to take you somewhere safe. The girl stared at her. You're a woman. Yes. Women don't fight. Elena thought about all the women she'd ever known. Her mother, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them fed. Her sister, who'd survived things that would have broken anyone else. The female soldiers she'd served with. The ones who'd carried the same weight as their brothers while carrying something else too. Something heavier, something invisible. Some women do, she said. She began moving the children toward the door. They went in groups, the older ones helping the younger ones, their fear slowly transforming into something that looked almost like trust. Elena was counting. 18 in, 18 out. Simple math. The kind of math that could save you. Or kill you. At 15, she heard the footsteps behind her. She turned. In the doorway stood a man with a rifle. He was young, maybe 19, with the thin beard of someone who wanted to look older than he was. His eyes moved from Elena to the children and back to Elena. He raised his weapon. Elena raised hers. Time stopped. In that frozen moment, she saw everything. The children behind her. The young man in front of her. The choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She fired. The young man fell. The children screamed. Elena kept moving. Outside, the world was still chaos, but the chaos had shifted. The helicopters were coming. She could hear them now, the steady beat of rotors that sounded like salvation. Briggs was shouting coordinates. Men were falling back toward the extraction point. Elena led the children through the smoke, through the gunfire, through the nightmare geography of a battle she'd never been trained to fight. She led them with her voice, with her hands, with whatever part of her was still functioning when the rest had shut down. At some point, she was hit. She didn't feel it at first. Adrenaline does that, hides the damage until there's time to fall apart. She only noticed when her left leg stopped working properly, when each step became a negotiation between will and physics. She kept walking. Sergeant Webb found her 50 meters from the extraction point. She was carrying a child on her back and holding two more by the hand. Behind her, a line of small shadows followed like ducklings. "Captain," Webb said, just that, just her rank. But he said it differently than before. He said it like he meant it. "There's 18, Elena said. I counted 18. She counted again, there in the smoke and the noise. 18 small faces looking at her with eyes that would remember this. Night forever. Then she let herself fall. Elena Vasquez spent the next 14 months in hospitals and rehabilitation centers, learning to walk again, learning to sleep without screaming, learning to live with the piece of shrapnel that would remain in her leg for the rest of her life. She received visitors. Briggs came first, 6 weeks after the operation, still walking with a cane from his own injuries. He sat beside her bed for 20 minutes without saying anything. Then he handed her a coin, a commander's coin, with ODA 7215 engraved on one side. "You earned it," he said. Webb came next, then Delaney, who'd somehow survived his wounds and was already making plans to return to the field. They came one by one, the men who'd doubted her, the men who'd watched her run toward gunfire, the men who'd seen her carry children through a kill zone while bleeding from wounds she wouldn't acknowledge. They came, and they said the same thing. "Thank you." No one mentioned that she was a woman. No one mentioned that she was an intelligence officer. No one mentioned any of the things that had seemed so important before. Some truths transcend categories. The Distinguished Service Cross citation took 3 years to process. Classified operations require classified reviews. The paperwork moved through channels that didn't officially exist, approved by committees that would never appear in any organizational chart. When the notification finally arrived, Elena was working as a civilian consultant at a defense contractor in Virginia. She'd left the Army 2 years earlier, officially for medical reasons, unofficially for all the reasons that accumulate when you've given everything and still feel like you're carrying something you can't put down. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with the other things she didn't know what to do with. Her mother called when the news leaked. "I always knew," she said, crying. "I always knew you were special." Elena didn't feel special. She felt tired. She felt like someone who'd done what needed to be done and would do it again if she had to, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because she couldn't figure out how to be anything else. The ceremony was scheduled for October, Fort Bragg, full honors. She almost didn't go. It was her sister who convinced her, during a phone call that lasted 3 hours and covered everything from their childhood to their futures to the particular kind of courage it takes to accept recognition you're not sure you deserve. "You're not going for yourself," her sister said. "You're going for every woman who comes after you. You're going so they can see what's possible." Elena thought about the little girl in Afghanistan, the one with the scar on her forehead, the one who'd said women don't fight. "Okay," she said, "I'll go." The ceremony began at 9:30. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of uniforms and civilians. He saw generals he'd served under and privates he'd never meet. He saw the families of fallen soldiers, their grief worn like medals. He saw Specialist Kowalski and Private First Class Tanner standing at attention near the back, their faces still flushed with the morning's mistake. And he saw Elena Vasquez sitting in the front row in her navy dress and worn cardigan, looking at the memorial wall where a new name would be added today. Webb cleared his throat. 7 years ago, he began, I was a sergeant first class, assigned to an operation I still can't fully describe. I was skeptical of our intelligence officer. I was wrong. He told the story, not all of it, because all of it was still classified, but enough. Enough to make the audience understand, enough to make them see. He told them about a woman who'd refused to stay where she was told, about a woman who'd run toward danger when everyone else was running away, about a woman who'd carried children through gunfire while bleeding, who'd kept counting because the count was all that mattered, who'd proven something that shouldn't have needed proving in the first place. He told them about courage that doesn't announce itself, about valor that shows up quietly, does what needs to be done, and asks for nothing in return. When he finished, he turned to Elena. Captain Vasquez, would you please come forward? She stood. The slight limp was more pronounced than it had been that morning, the day's exertions taking their toll. She walked to the podium with the same patient steadiness she'd shown at the checkpoint, the same quiet certainty she'd carried through a firefight and a field hospital in all the long years since. The general stepped forward with the medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest honor the military could bestow, for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy, the citation read. Captain Elena Vasquez distinguished herself by exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty during combat operations in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, on 14th of July, 2012. The words continued. They described actions that seemed, in the formal language of military commendations, almost ordinary. They couldn't capture the fear. They couldn't capture the choice. They couldn't capture what it meant to be a woman running toward gunfire in a world that had told her, 1,000 different ways, that she didn't belong there. The medal was pinned to her dress. Applause filled the parade ground. Elena looked out at the crowd. She saw the generals and the senators and the families and the young soldiers who would carry the future on their shoulders. She saw Kowalski and Tanner, the guards who'd stopped her at the gate, who hadn't known, who couldn't have known. She didn't blame them. She'd spent her entire career being stopped at gates, literal ones and figurative ones. Gates that said women didn't belong here. Gates that said intelligence officers weren't real soldiers. Gates that required credentials she was never quite given. She'd learned that the credentials weren't the point. The point was what you did when you got past the gate. The point was whether you could be trusted when it mattered. The point was the person you became when no one was checking your list. Elena stepped to the microphone. I'm not a hero, she said. Her voice was steady, the same voice that had told 18 children they were going to be okay, the same voice that had counted and refused to stop counting. Heroes are in movies. Heroes know what they're doing. I was just someone who couldn't walk away. She paused. People ask me what it was like, running toward that school. They expect me to say I was brave. The truth is, I was terrified. I'm still terrified sometimes, when I think about it. She looked at the memorial wall, at the names carved in stone, at the weight of all those lives that could never be unlived. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what happens when you decide the fear doesn't get to choose. It's what happens when you see something that needs to be done, and you do it, even though everything in you is screaming to run the other way. She turned to face the crowd again. I was stopped at the gate this morning. The guards were doing their job. My name wasn't on their list. And I stood there thinking about all the gates I've been stopped at in my life, all the lists I wasn't on, all the places where someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong. A murmur rippled through the audience. Elena let it settle. Here's what I've learned. The gate doesn't matter. The list doesn't matter. What matters is what you do when you finally get through. What matters is whether you can look at yourself afterward and know that you did what was right, even when it was hard, even when no one was watching, even when the world was telling you to stay in your lane. She touched the medal on her chest. The weight of it was slight, almost nothing. The weight of what it represented was something else entirely. I didn't save those children because I wanted a medal. I saved them because they were children, and they were scared, and someone had to do something. That's not heroism. That's just being human. She looked at the young soldiers in the back, at Kowalski and Tanner with their flushed faces and their newfound understanding. To everyone out there who's ever been stopped at a gate, who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever had to work twice as hard to prove half as much. Keep going. Keep showing up. Keep being the kind of person who does what needs to be done, whether or not anyone's watching, whether or not anyone's keeping count. She paused. Because someone's always watching, and someone's always counting, even if it's just you. The ceremony ended at 1100. Afterward, there was a reception in the officers' club, handshakes and some photographs and conversations that circled around the things that couldn't be said. Elena moved through it all with the same quiet grace she'd shown at the checkpoint, accepting congratulations she didn't seek and praise she didn't need. At some point, Specialist Kowalski approached her. He was nervous, his hands fidgeting at his sides, his face carrying an apology he didn't know how to give. "Ma'am," he said, I'm sorry about this morning. If I'd known..." Elena stopped him with a hand on his arm. "If you'd known, you would have done things differently. But you didn't know, and you did your job. That's nothing to apologize for." Kowalski looked at her. "How can you be so okay with it?" Elena considered the question. She thought about all the times she hadn't been okay with it, all the rage and frustration and exhaustion she'd carried. She thought about the years it had taken to reach a place where she could stand here, in this moment, and feel something like peace. "Because anger is heavy," she said finally, "and I've carried enough heavy things." She smiled at him, a small smile that carried more wisdom than he could understand. "You're going to meet a lot of people in your career, Specialist. Some of them won't look like what you expect. Some of them won't have the right credentials or the right uniform or the right anything. But that doesn't mean they don't belong. It just means you haven't figured out yet why they do." She patted his arm and moved on. Later that afternoon, Elena stood alone in front of the memorial wall. The reception had ended. The crowds had dispersed. The parade ground was empty except for the flags and the silence and the names carved in stone. She found the new name, the one that had been added that morning in a small ceremony before the larger one, a soldier who'd died in the same operation that had earned her this medal. A man named Private First Class Timothy Chen, who'd been 22 years old and engaged to be married and full of plans he'd never get to keep. He'd been the first one hit when the ambush began. He'd never seen her run to the school. He'd never seen the children she'd saved. He'd just been there, doing his job, and then he wasn't. Elena touched his name. The stone was cool beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you too." The wind picked up, rustling the flags, carrying the sound of ceremony and remembrance across the empty ground. Elena Vasquez stood there for a long time, a small woman in a navy dress, carrying a medal she'd never asked for and a memory she'd never lose. She thought about gates and guards and the lists that determined who belonged where. She thought about the children in Afghanistan, grown now, living lives that had almost ended in a smoke-filled school. She thought about the soldiers who'd doubted her, and the soldiers who'd believed her, and the soldiers who'd never made it home. She thought about courage and what it really meant. Not the absence of fear, not the presence of certainty, just the decision, made in a moment of absolute darkness, that some things matter more than survival, that some doors are worth opening even when you don't know what's on the other side, that some gates are worth passing through even when your name isn't on the list. The sun was setting over Fort Bragg. Orange light spilled across the parade ground, turning the white chairs to gold and the memorial wall to something that looked almost like warmth. Elena turned away from the wall and began the long walk to the parking lot. Tomorrow she would return to her quiet life, her consulting job, her small apartment, her cat and her books and her nightmares that came less often now. She would be a civilian again, anonymous, unremarkable. But today she was something else. Today she was proof that courage doesn't come with credentials, that valor isn't reserved for those who look the part, that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody expected, standing patiently at the gate, waiting for the world to catch up to the truth. Her story isn't about gates. It isn't about guards. It isn't about the ceremony or the medal or the moment when everything finally aligned. Her story is about what it takes to keep going when every door is closed, what it takes to stay steady when everyone is watching, what it takes to be the kind of person who runs toward the fire, not because you're brave, but because you can't figure out how to be anything else. History remembers the ones who break through, but maybe it should also remember the breaking, the 1,000 small fractures that come before the opening, the patient, persistent pressure of someone who refuses to accept that the gate is final. Elena Vasquez was stopped at her own ceremony. She waited. And when the gate finally opened, she walked through with the same quiet dignity she'd carried through everything else. That's not heroism. That's just being human. And sometimes being human is the most heroic thing of all.